Hey, what's up, AP History Champions? This is your Chapter 21 video lecture, Expanding Horizons of Cross-Cultural Interaction. If you may remember from class, I told you guys this might be the most important chapter of the entire book, as this is the first time we see true global interaction. Okay, so that's wild. So get ready for that. But anyway, this is the first time we see people from Eurasia, Africa interact with people from North, South, and Central America. But before that, just expanded long distance trade we see during this period. The Silk Roads continued, as well as the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean basin. There's also the trans-Saharan caravan routes, all trade routes we've looked at previously, and this development of trading cities, of these big places where basically you had open markets and that's how people made money. And there was a degree of local devastation with these interactions, especially when you consider the Mongols, but trade was always the big goal. And in this period, we see the emergence of a key voice from this era of Marco Polo. Now, he's not exactly the most reliable source. He wrote his entire, well, actually, he didn't even write any of the things that he supposedly did. Supposedly, he just said everything to this well-known travel writer while he was sitting in prison during one of the wars between Venice and Genoa, two Italian city-states, and the guy wrote it down. And there's some skeptics that seem to think that maybe he didn't necessarily have as an authentic experience that his writing purports, but there is a lot of truth to what he says, so we think he might be mostly telling the truth, but he might be embellishing it too. But he does reveal some key insight. Supposedly, he entered the service of Kublai Khan and was one of his main attendants while he was in China, and returned to Venice after a 17-year absence. He's generally regarded as one of the great travelers of the world. And here we see the extent of his travels. He kind of just made a big, giant loop all the way from Europe, all the way through the Indian Ocean, up the Indian coast, and on his way back to Europe. So pretty amazing story, but this is where we see expanded trade occur. But the guy who's a more remarkable traveler in all this is Ibn Battuta, who could be one of the great travelers of all time. I'm just going to gloss over this bit about increased Muslim and Christian interaction. Basically, Muslims were almost aligned with the Mongols, but not quite. The Mongols were invited by Pope Innocent IV to convert to Christianity, but the Mongols weren't having it. Their counteroffer was Christians accept Mongol rule or face destruction. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And the Christians sent this guy, Rabban Salma, to try and further convert and convince the Mongols to join their side. Did not really work, and several of the Mongols did convert to Islam in the Ilkhan of Persia and Gazan, which is basically that portion of the many different incantations, well, 4 or 5, of the Mongolian Empire, but it did not convert the entire empire, obviously. But to Ibn Battuta, perhaps the greatest scholar and traveler combination we have seen in world history. He was an Islamic scholar. He was trained as a lawyer. And essentially, he just traveled throughout the Muslim world and sort of wrote down what he saw in terms of how Muslims were living. He wasn't always the most kind person in terms of the people he saw. Supposedly, while he was a qadi, which is basically a judge, in one area, he gave out very severe punishments for someone who got caught drinking alcohol. He gave them 40 lashes, cut off a person's hand as a punishment for theft, and he just could not get over what women dressed like in the Maldive Islands. It was an African area, and it's pretty common for women to not really dress very much. So that sort of freaked him out. He kind of came from a more conservative area. He came from Morocco, where it was expected that the whole bit of women covering up, of being sheltered and only being for the eyes of their husbands, and that was it. But that was his whole thing. But his record gives us a very, very keen account of what was going on throughout the Muslim world, which by this time in the 14th century, very, 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 very large. But in addition to this, we see a few missionary campaigns, both by Muslims and Christians. We see a few Sufi missionaries travel throughout the Muslim territories, and we see Christian missionaries would accompany their crusaders that they went along with. One of the most noted voices is John of Montecorvino, who traveled to China in 1291 and was able to gain a few converts in China. There is a decently sized Christian community within China that we'll see grow and expand later on. But during this, we have more and more cultural exchanges. We talked about the troubadours, who were these traveling musicians who kind of took this sort of idea from Muslim songs and love stories and sung about them throughout their travels and gained a lot of favor with particularly female members of wealthy European noble courts. But also there was not just a cultural diffusion and exchange, there was also a technological exchange. One of those key pieces was the magnetic compass from China, which would be a huge, huge, huge important piece as the Europeans venture out and gain more access to the world via sea travel, or maritime travel, as it's oftentimes referred to. Also, in addition to this, was the spread of crops, the spread of citrus fruits, Asian rice, and notably sugarcane. In many places in Europe, they never had sugar, which seems kind of hard to believe. But sugar is such a huge part of our life. It's unfortunately found in many of our diets, whether we know it or not. Also, a highly addictive substance, too. But Muslims introduced crystallized sugar to Europeans, and the Europeans never looked back, and neither did their teeth. But the demand for it increased rapidly, and with that demand was basically semi-industrialized agricultural output, basically the use of plantations. And with these plantations necessitated workers, and Europeans found those workers in the form of slaves. And this is where we start to see the beginnings of African-based slavery as Europeans begin to use the Muslim precedent of extracting Africans and using them as labor. It would begin in various small islands off the coast of Western Africa, used by predominantly Portuguese and Spanish sugar plantation owners, and obviously would expand to the New World, as we'll see in the African slave trade. So if it seems like I'm being short about African slavery in this chapter, that's not necessarily my intention. It's just that later on we'll get into much greater detail regarding the African slave trade. So if you're really keen on learning about slavery, hold your horses. It definitely comes in full vigor very, very soon. But in addition to this, we also have the advent of gunpowder. It was actually a bomb, but you get the case. That technology reached Europe by the mid-13th century and came predominantly from China. And obviously the use of gunpowder would have a huge, huge impact as well. Though it was kind of a slow burn, no pun intended, so to speak. The Europeans were not really adept at using gunpowder in a weaponized form much later, until really the 1700s and the 1800s. But until then, it was effective to a degree, but really not until, honestly, Napoleon do we really start to see gunpowder used with great effect. It was a very inaccurate way of attacking, and before that, bows and arrows were a much better projectile weapon if used in warfare. But once Europeans did figure out gunpowder, the world would really never be the same. After going into this whole idea of expanded cultural interaction and expanded regional trade, the chapter gets into a bit on crisis and recovery. And that crisis came in two forms: a little ice age, which actually occurred about 500 years, from about 1300 CE till about 1500, in which things just got cold for some reason. Summers were shorter, winters were longer, and the overall geological aspects of the earth was just colder. Needless to say, that's really, really bad for crops, and it caused a lot of people to starve to death. So not as much food was made, not as many people ate, more people died. And on top of that is the much more publicized phenomenon of the bubonic plague, which was this massively contagious, massively deadly disease that actually spread from southwest China and made its way west across the Eurasian continent. What we do know about it was carried by fleas and was carried by rodents, and basically it was transported via trade, via ships, and just made its way west. It really, really exposed heavily populated areas in Europe, as well as the Muslim world, as people lived oftentimes in close proximity to each other and to animals and did not necessarily live the most clean lifestyles you've ever seen. Um, and it wasn't just a European thing. It was a Muslim thing. It was an Indian thing. It was a Chinese thing. It was a Northern African thing. It affected everybody. It didn't necessarily care what race you were. It was a very non-discriminant phenomenon. In 1346, we see it appear in Black Sea ports, so areas that are kind of in modern-day Russia. By 1347, it makes its way to Mediterranean ports. By 1348, into Western Europe. The disease pretty much ran its course in the 1300s. It was called the bubonic plague because people would generate these growths called buboes in your armpits and groin area. They would eventually burst, and usually when that happened, you had just days to live. There was actually 3 different diseases in the Black Death. One affected your skin, one affected your lungs, and one affected your bloodstream. The bloodstream pretty much was a guaranteed death. The one that affected your skin gave you about 50%. Needless to say, 60 to 70% mortality rate, and usually you died within days. The extreme northern climates were a little less affected because those places did not have as much interaction among humans. Humans passed the disease more adept than anything else. India and certain sub-Saharan areas were also largely unaffected. Interestingly enough, as were many Jewish communities, especially in Eastern Europe, generally because of their adherence to kosher rules. They did not live as dirty of a life as those per se in like London or Paris. And also they didn't necessarily interact with as many people because they were largely isolated due to, one, anti-Semitism. People didn't necessarily trust the Jewish communities. And 2, they largely kept to themselves as per their religion. But the population overall declined. Between 1300 and 1400, we see in China it dropped nearly 10%, and in Europe it dropped nearly 20%. A lot of numbers you oftentimes see is that Europe dropped its population by roughly a third. However, we see in 1500 it made a comeback, but with that came a lot of change. With so many people dead, it created a huge labor shortage, and with that labor shortage, people recognized that they could demand higher wages because there was literally hardly anyone else who would take those positions, and so they kind of had the upper hand. They controlled the supply of the labor, so they could ask for more wages. There's a greater movement of populations. There's a greater movement from people from the countryside to the cities, and with that movement, people's lives changed. The governments tried to freeze wages to prevent people from gaining too much power via money and to stop the serfs, these people who were sort of tied to the land, from moving to the cities. And as a result, a whole lot of social unrest. There were wide-scale riots, there were wide-scale revolutions because of this massive social change, predominantly in Europe and in the Middle Eastern areas. And in China, recovery was present as well because of the Black Plague. It basically was kind of the final straw of the Yuan dynasty. If you remember the mandate of heaven that we looked at earlier, the Chinese belief that people will have the mandate of heaven to rule over China as long as things are smooth. Well, a plague is certainly not smooth. And with the collapse of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols left in droves. They basically were driven out by the Chinese, thanks in large part to a rebellion led by this guy made out of solid gold. He wasn't actually made out of gold, but he was actually quite an impressive figure, a very skilled warrior. He was an impoverished orphan, and basically he joined the military and was able to prove his prowess via military action. And he was claimed the new emperor of China and called his dynasty the Ming Dynasty, which really means the brilliant dynasty, and that would last for nearly 300 years. And the centralization of the Ming Dynasty was key to its success. They reestablished the Confucian education system, in which understanding Confucian thoughts and teachings was key to their whole aspect of learning and was the key to rising up within the Ming Dynasty, just as it had been in the Tang and Song dynasties, just as it had been in the Han Dynasty. And They were very, very severe on anyone who was suspected of treason or basically doing anything that would cause harm to the emperor. Um, they relied on these emissaries called mandarins, and they had a heavy reliance on servants known as eunuchs. Now, fun fact, or maybe not so fun fact about eunuchs, eunuchs are essentially castrated male servants. In case you don't know what castrated means, it means your testicles have been removed. Yes, sounds gross, but that's how it was. Um, but basically, the reason they trusted them, because one, they couldn't have kids, so they weren't worried about them trying to pass power along to their children, and two, any worry about them trying to do any funny business with any of the female members of the emperor's family wasn't going to happen. And that centralized structure was able to last beyond the Ming Dynasty through the Qing Dynasty to 1911, when the whole dynastic system of China fell apart. Or didn't.
Whoa.
Who knows? Okay. But anyway, with this economic revival, there was also a cultural revival. There was lots of conscripted labor. Conscripted labor basically means like people were almost drafted to work. And with that became an increase in manufacturing of porcelain silk, and there was an attempt to sort of remove that Mongol legacy by promoting traditional Chinese culture. The Emperor Yonglei commissioned a massive project to enroll an encyclopedia in which he wanted to basically catalog every single bit of Chinese learning throughout the entire empire, and it consisted of a 2,300 roll, so like rolls, like scrolls, encyclopedia. You guys are probably too young to remember encyclopedias, but back in the day, it used to be you just had this big, massive volume of books that had like all the information for the most part. My family had one, but it was written in like 1957, and it was super outdated. But that's like all we had till the internet kind of came along and ruined encyclopedias forever. But moving over to Europe, recovery there came in the form of increased state building. Remember, before this, the whole idea of countries was not quite a thing yet, but as more and more of these trading cities grew in power, they became more and more united in regional states, because those regional states could offer them protection and could offer them strength and unity. But with this sort of unity came certain bonds, and those bonds often came in the form of taxes. The Italian states had bonds in which sort of you gave money to the Italian state, and they would basically ensure that your investment would be held safe, that it wouldn't fall apart, that you couldn't get robbed, so to speak. In France, the sort of bond that you had with your government came in the form of taxes. They would tax things like salt and sales. So every sale that you made, you had to pay a little bit to the government, and the idea was that the government gave you protection in return. England, same thing. A hearth tax, it says here a head tax, but that basically means like a tax for every person that maybe you are employing. So kind of like an employer's tax, so to speak, as well as a plow tax. So every plow you have, you had to pay a tax on that. And with this came large standing armies to provide protection for these people so that they wouldn't get their stuff stolen or wouldn't get their property destroyed. One of the largest armies back then, which is actually kind of laughably large considering our modern standards.
Oh my God, that is funny!
That's how small they were. And they had an army of about 15,000. When you compare that to World War I, you had literally 1 million people dying in a single battle. That's kind of laughably small. In Spain, we see expanded statehood in Fernando of Aragon marrying Isabel of Castile in 1469. The two major kingdoms within Spain married and basically completed the effort called the Reconquista, where they basically retook the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims that had been living there. And it actually expanded beyond the Iberian Peninsula into Italy and took over portions of that. And one of the places they took over was a guy by the name of Cristobal Colon, who would be dead set on his conquest to discover China, or basically take over China on behalf of the Spanish crown. Needless to say, he failed. Big fart noise for him. Okay. In Russia, we see the emergence of that statehood as well. You have to remember, that Russia, I'm going to pull up a map here, was right on the edge of the Khan of the Golden Horde, basically this area right here. So for them, dealing with the Mongols was very, very much a realistic thing. That's where we enter this guy with this sort of like half egg crown right there. Peter the Great, or sorry, Ivan the Great. Peter the Great comes later. Ivan the Third, who basically said, you know what, let's just stop paying taxes. Let's just stop paying taxes to the powerful Khan and see what he does. By then, the Mongol Empire was so weak they really couldn't do anything about it. And because of that, he was able to expand his territorial expansions. According to this map, we see that his area here, which is basically Moscow, he was known of as a Muscovy king, meaning just Moscow, and he was able to expand it during his reign, for most of his reign, basically well beyond his own territory. And as we see here, that the expansion of Russia would further continue and they would begin their own sort of Eurasian imperialist intentions, which they still hold to this day. Also in Europe, we see a cultural emergence. The Renaissance would begin, which we'll get into in greater detail later, but a rebirth of classical culture. Basically means people started looking more at the teachings and learnings of the Romans and the Greeks and started to re-examine those pieces instead of solely relying on Christian doctrine as their sole source of information. Artists began to use perspective as a way of looking at things, like looking at things with depth, looking at things with lines to sort of see things with as being three-dimensional instead of just two-dimensional. And they worked with real human anatomy and musculature. So their art started to look more realistic. They started to embrace the beauty of the human body rather than just sort of embrace the beauty that they saw in Christian ideas and Christian interpretations. And we also see the use of domed cathedrals, which is a imitation of the Christian and Roman domes that we had seen back in the Byzantine empires. And we see in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome that very use. And with this came the emergence of humanist literature. In humanities, we see it in literature, history, and moral philosophy. And it was this idea that people should focus on human understanding, not necessarily going away from Christianity, but basically discovering what made us unique as human beings. It also devoted itself to rediscovering the classic Latin texts that were often ignored in libraries that were focused primarily on Christian texts. But the humanist moral thought hinged on this idea that you shouldn't just live this scholarly life in a monastery by yourself. What you should really do is go out and engage with the world and try to help people, try to engage in business and do good things for yourself and for the community. It was basically a way of reconciling Christianity in this rapidly changing world, which was growing more and more focused on the accumulation of wealth and material. It was sort of becoming overpowering in Christian society. We'll see that will create new tensions as well. But in Europe and the larger world, artists expressed a greater interest in Byzantine and the Asian worlds. You had various scholars and artists traveling throughout the Eurasian world to try to learn more. People traveling to places within the Muslim world to try to learn more, just as we had seen earlier when people were traveling to Seville in Spain to learn from Muslim scholars there. And with this grew exploration and colonization, which is sort of the big linchpin of this whole chapter and in world history. This sort of marks the turning point in world history of sort of isolated people living on different continents to becoming truly connected, for better, for worse. Interestingly enough, the Ming Dynasty was sort of the first to sort of begin this massive expansion and exploration effort, even though we don't think of the Chinese as the ones leading exploration. But the emperor of the Ming Dynasty, Yongle, engaged a very capable admiral named Zheng He to mount a huge naval expedition between 1405 and 1433. For the most part, he traveled throughout the Indian Ocean and along the East African coast. The ships he traveled with were absolutely massive. They were several times larger than the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, just kind of comically larger than those. And the purpose for that was so that they could travel to places and be able to subdue any sort of resistance to their aims that may come about. Basically, they were a traveling army, so to speak, just huge ships with huge amounts of people on them, and they were very capable at basically attacking and subduing anybody who dared resist them, which in a lot of cases was not the case. Most of the time, these various people would sort of give in because they knew if they traded with the Chinese, they could become very, very wealthy, and they were correct. Interestingly enough, China completely abandoned their aims at exploring and colonizing the world, which is a very, very interesting turning point because had they continued, who knows, maybe it would have been the Chinese who discovered the Americas rather than the Spaniards. And that would certainly pose a very, very different sort of worldview that we look at today. I'm not huge on sort of hypotheticals, but it's always kind of fun to think of what would have happened had it been Zheng He who discovered America rather than Columbus. Maybe we would have Zheng He Day. But the reason they stopped, that is the Chinese, was that the Mongols were seemingly threatening up in the north, and the Chinese were never one to really want to branch out. Remember the whole idea of Zhongguo, the central kingdom? You don't really go beyond. Everything we have is here. And they abandoned all aspects of going out and colonizing to their detriment. And here we see the voyages of Zheng He, as you can see, mostly through the South China Sea into Southeastern Asia, into India, in the Bay of Bengal, across the Arabian Sea, and into the eastern part of Africa. Here we see the expansion of European aims to discover parts of the world, mostly from Portugal and Spain. Portugal sort of led the way, not sort of, they did, led the way in terms of exploration of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. And their motives were essentially two. One was profit, they wanted to make money, and the second was to spread Christianity. When you read the accounts of various discoverers and conquistadors and those sorts of people, you'll see all sorts of Christian rhetoric just sort of flowing throughout that. Everything is for the glory of God, and by the grace of God, we discovered such and such. So you see that over and over and over again. The Portuguese led the way early on. Their main effort was to search for a sea right to the Indian Ocean basin, due to a large part because the Muslim traders would tax the Portuguese so much that it just wasn't quite profitable to go over land anymore. So they tried to find a different sea route, which would allow them to basically find their own way. The first person to really focus his efforts on that was Prince Henrique of Portugal. We know him as Henry the Navigator, and he seized the Strait of Gibraltar, which allowed him to easily travel out. He began the encouragement of major Atlantic voyages and focused all his efforts on discovering better ways to travel, developing seafaring technology so that ships could travel faster and maneuver better in the ocean, and was largely successful. With that, he was able to colonize various Atlantic islands, as I said before, mostly for the purpose of developing sugarcane, of developing the new substance that was sweeping across Europe and gaining huge amounts of popularity. With the use of sugar plantations, the volume of slave trade increased dramatically. And as you have probably heard before in one of your history classes, if you haven't, you've been taking the wrong history classes. But by the time all was said and done, roughly 12 million Africans would be deported to the Americas for slave labor in the span of about 400 years, which is a staggeringly short amount of time to transport by force that many people, no matter what way you look at it. But it began with Indian Ocean trade, and it began with mostly two guys. This guy up here, Bartolomeo Diaz, who was the first to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and this guy here, Vasco da Gama, who was able to sail all the way around the Horn of Africa up into India. And just to go back to our map here, okay, Bartolomeo Diaz basically got to here and turned around. Okay, Vasco da Gama got to here and went all the way around, and thanks to talking to some Muslim traders, was able to learn about the shifting monsoon winds and was able to go to India and back. This was basically completely uncharted territory for them. They had no idea how long Africa was. For the most part, maps of Africa before Bartolomé Diaz was basically it ended here. This was like literally the edge of the earth to them. They had no idea this had existed before then. Needless to say, this discovery proved to be very, very enlightening for the Europeans as well as it was profitable. Enter this guy, Christopher Columbus, whose search for a western sea route to the Indian Ocean prompted him to discover the Americas. We always say discover with those quotation marks because there's already people there. You can't really discover something that already exists. But he was able to convince the Spanish monarchs of the time, Fernando and Isabel, to basically finance his voyage, and he left in 1492. He made landfall in San Salvador. He even promised a huge cash sum to the first guy on his boat who discovered land and actually cheated him out of it. Christopher Columbus, by all accounts, was pretty much a bastard. He was not a very good person. And we take a day off to remember him, but there's certainly a lot of justifiably upset people that we have a day off from. In fact, a lot of people call it Indigenous Peoples Day. But he spent his whole life believing he had discovered the Indies. Basically, Columbus knew the world was round, but he was completely wrong in terms of the size of the earth. He had no idea that there is these two giant land masses here and on it a whole bunch of people. He thought he could travel this way and end up in the Indies, like India here. Needless to say, he never made it. But the Spaniards would discover that these lands and the people living on it would prove to be extraordinarily profitable for them, and thus would begin prolonged interaction between Eurasian people and the people of the Americas. And as we'll see, the end results of these were initially extraordinarily violent, but never in any way predictable, as we normally see in history. But anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment after I post. And thank you guys for watching, if you indeed watched the entire thing.